Basically, in the last term, the court overturned that principle, which we call a judicial humility, the
Mm-hmm.
principle that the courts are not the experts on all these highly technical issues and that we should defer to the agency's expertise.
You're listening to Good Faith Weekly. I'm Mitch Randall.
And I'm Missy Randall.
We're here each week exploring the intersection of faith and culture.
We find people who stand up, speak out, and step forward
for inclusion, freedom, and justice for all.
It's time for Good Faith Weekly.
Brought to you by Good Faith Media. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, Missy and I are going to catch up. We're going to talk about Good Faith Media's Readers and Writers Retreat that we're attending this week in North Carolina. Then later on the pod, we're going to sit down with the president and CEO of Democracy Forward, Skye Perryman, to talk about this year's election as well as the dangers of Project 2025. But before we begin, we want to take time to remember all of the victims of Hurricane Milton in Florida. At the time of this recording, the hurricane is just coming of ashore, and Missy and I really want to offer our prayers and our well wishes to all of those who are suffering down there in Florida. We cannot imagine what you're going through at this time. And as we did with our folks in North Carolina, we want to encourage all of our listeners to give to local relief efforts because the need is great. And so we can come together and help one another. That's what we're supposed to do as people of faith. And we just want to think about all of those who have been victims of this natural disaster. So we hope that you're doing well, and we're sending all of our love and support your way. Hello there, Missy.
Hey, how are you?
I am quite well, and you?
I'm well. I'm still kind of snickering about your night last night.
Well, there's going to be more to tell on that one.
I mean, that is our tagline, is it not? Yeah, so we are in beautiful Stoneville, North Carolina.
Absolutely.
Kicking off our Writers and Readers Retreat. And we arrived a day early to get things set up. And we're staying in this lovely little cottage in the woods of North Carolina.
Very rural, very beautiful, but you know.
We're city kids.
We are city kids.
We're not used to like woodsy noises, right?
Yeah, there's sounds out there, Missy, at night.
There are sounds, lots of things that creak and howl. And at one point, you and I were traversing the property, unloading things last night. It was after dark. And we did hear a pack of, what were they? Were those coyotes?
It was coyotes, yes.
You just deprived Cliff of an opportunity to insert sound effects by making your own. Those were organic, folks. You're welcome.
That's right.
Anywho, so we heard this pack of
coyotes.
Some sort coyotes.
Had to be
Okay.
coyotes.
I mean, and they were loud.
They were so loud, yeah.
They had apparently...
They were on the hunt.
They were on the hunt. It was really startling. Anywho, fast forward a couple of hours. We've gone to bed. We were so exhausted from flying. You, of course, went right to sleep.
Right to sleep.
Me, of course, brain starts spinning. I'm wide awake. I can't sleep. I end up just deciding to forget it. I'm getting up out of bed. I went to a different room so that I could, do what you do when you can't sleep, scroll on my phone, whatnot. Prepare for this podcast recording today, believe it or not. And then I started hearing noises.
Right.
In this little room that I was in, which had a locked door, but I was scared because I started hearing noises and didn't know what they were. Several minutes later, I was afraid to even walk back down the hall to our room because I thought somebody else was in the hallway. And you texted.
Yes.
So take it from there.
Okay, so let me set the scene from my standpoint. So yes, we were exhausted, we were asleep, and then
You were asleep.
I was asleep, but I was awakened when you got out of bed, and I heard you leave the room. And you know, we're at a retreat center. We've got participants of the retreat arriving over the next couple of days, and I thought, well, maybe somebody arrived early and, was trying to get a hold of you to get in the room late at night. And so I thought, oh, she's out there helping somebody. Well, I waited.
As I do.
As you do. You're such a giver. As I waited and waited, you never came back. And I just kept imagining in my mind that you were, huddled, next to a tree or shimmied up a tree with a pack of coyotes.
Those coyotes are coming for me, man.
Nipping at you. So I get out of bed. I get it because it's cold here at night. I got a coat on and I start traversing the retreat area. I was outside looking for you. And finally dawned on me, why don't I just text her? I mean, it's late at night.
That's the thing. Why didn't you just text me?
Again, it was late at night. I wasn't thinking.
Your logic was not right because you turned on your Find My Friend, my locator, your locator.
I did try to find you.
And it located me out in the woods, right?
Yes, it did locate you out in the woods. So that's why I thought you were out there.
So instead of texting me and saying, "Hey, are you okay out there in the woods?"
I went to find you.
You went to find me.
Oh, I was being a protector. And my native skills started to kick in.
That's right. Your native skills and your GPS started to kick in, right? So you go out to find me, which apparently was the noise I was hearing in the hallway as you were leaving the cottage, but I was afraid to leave the room I was in.
Because I've been told that do not leave the cottage without a key or you can't get back in. So I, opened the door, did not have my key, had to go back, get the key. So I was making some noise on my way out.
Right.
To find you, to rescue you.
Anyways, finally, after several minutes, you decided to text and say, "Hey, where are you?" And I said, "I'm in this tiny room and I'm hearing noises and afraid to leave." To which you said, "That was me."
That was me.
Come back to our room. Anyways, it was kind of a funny start.
It was.
I'm
so glad you didn't get eaten by a dingo. Eaten by dingo.
Speaking of words. Okay, so we're here at our writers retreat and we just had our opening session, been talking about the importance of words, the meanings of words. And like I said, I was up last night and couldn't sleep. So I started just Googling for our retreat here, just for funsies, about words and about the importance of words, and came across, not surprisingly, Google results talking about grammar debates.
Oh, no. This is my nightmare.
I know.
I knew this quiz was coming eventually.
It's not a quiz. We're not going to quiz.
The only thing worse would be a spelling test.
We did talk about it in our opening session of our writers retreat. One of the questions when people introduced themselves was, "Are you team
comma or Oxford comma versus team no Oxford comma?"
This was so funny to me because I thought people would say yes or no. People were either pro Oxford comma or afraid to comment. So I thought that was so funny. Genuinely afraid to comment.
There's an Oxford comma mafia out there that will come get you.
It was really funny and really enlightening. But I just thought, this is fun. This is obviously in the column of debates that don't matter, right? I mean, in this world that we're living in right now of so many debates that do absolutely matter, and we'll talk about that in a minute. I thought it just would be fun to tell you. Did you know that it is okay now to end a sentence with a preposition?
I did.
Okay, I did too. And it has been really difficult for me in the writing process, even on just a social media post or whatever. I know it's okay. Like, I know somebody has told me it's okay. Webster's, whoever, Grammarly, they've said it's okay, but it still makes me twitchy. So anyways, you can now do that. There's big debate over possessive apostrophes with words that end in S. And did you know that in 2007, the Arkansas House, elected officials, had a vote on this?
This is going to be rich.
And they voted to officially denote possessives as Arkansans. Not the people. Just like if you say an Arkansas forest, like something as it's basically a S apostrophe S instead of the more standard just Arkansas. Anyways, it's very interesting, very convoluted, but the Arkansas legislature voted on this. So tells you how important it is.
Kudos.
Some of the other hotly debated grammar topics are: do you put the punctuation inside or outside quotation marks?
That's
difficult for me.
Yeah.
I have a hard time. I want to put it inside because that's what I was taught, but apparently,
how about the period of the end of the sentence? Do you put it?
That's the debate.
Yeah.
So if you want me to look at that, it's mainly between grammarians in the U.S. and Britain.
The British.
What side do you fall on?
I was taught to put it inside the parentheses.
Right.
But I've noticed lately that there's been a lot of publications that put it outside the parentheses.
That's a British way.
Yeah.
So anyways, and then the one we've talked about internally, which gets you in a lot of trouble with our editors, is that you no longer should put 2 spaces at the end of a period. This is such an age thing.
It is.
But do you know why?
There is a legitimate reason for this, but tell me why.
Okay. So back when you and I were learning to type on typewriters,
Yes.
you would put 2 spaces at the end of a period to denote a sentence.
Mm-hmm.
And this is because on a typeset typewriter, you had an equal amount of space between each letter. So like an I,
right,
which is very small, took up the same amount of space on the typewriter as an M that's very wide.
Mm-hmm.
And so the double space helped denote your sentences. Well, computers, of course, are so smart that they are able to make your letters fit appropriately. So you no longer need double spaces to denote. And right now our listeners are snoozing. Anywho.
Well, wait till I pivot to the
But the biggest debate of all in grammar world, trust me, I spent many hours in the middle of the night Googling this, is in fact the Oxford comma.
The Oxford comma, yeah.
So
in the comment section, we want to know: are you team Oxford comma,
or are you afraid to say? Because that's basically
it's going to be the Jets and Sharks all over again.
The 2 camps. But yeah, so as we kick off this writers retreat, talking about and thinking about the importance of words.
Yes.
I also, in my Google search came across some other more important topics about words themselves, not just funny grammar debates. But I thought I would transition us into our interview today with some words that have really impacted history.
Okay, let's hear them.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it's really hard to read that now and not sing it Hamilton style.
I think our listeners would like to hear you cite that Hamilton style.
But yeah, we were thinking, and you opened up our session today talking about the importance of words and bringing words to life on the page. And words are important. Those words are incredibly important right now to ruminate on, to think about. So I thought I would give you a chance to talk about that and transition into our interview.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, you just really think about words having power and meaning and changing history. And here in the United States, especially when we think about our republic democracy, we think about the Declaration of Independence. We think about the United States Constitution. We think about the amendments, especially people of faith think about the First Amendment to the Constitution. We think about the Emancipation Proclamation. We think about Civil Rights Acts, Voters' Rights Acts, suffrage. All of these laws came to us through words being crafted in sentences into paragraphs, and eventually those words on a piece of paper or parchment were given life.
I thought you were going to say, is the letter of the Danbury Baptist to Thomas Jefferson.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe I skipped right over that.
Talk about words
yes,
changing the course of history.
Yeah, so this group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, who are being persecuted because they're Baptist by local Congregationalists, right? The third president, Thomas Jefferson, and, ask him to please help them live out their faith without persecution. And Jefferson writes them back and really crafts this incredible letter to them. And in that letter, he writes and coins the phrase, the wall of separation between church and state. And that little phrase in that letter to a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, changes the way we think about the relationship between church and state, and really solidifies what the First Amendment means when we talk about the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. Those words, that phrase, changed history forever.
And it all started with a little letter.
A little letter.
So you never know when your words are going to change the course of history.
Well, I'm glad you weren't eaten by a pack of coyotes, and
I mean, same. You need to up that life insurance.
But I'm also really glad that we got to sit down with Skye Perryman today this week from Democracy Forward. It's a great conversation.
Yeah, she and her team do amazing work. So
Absolutely.
I'm excited to introduce our listeners to her.
Stay tuned.
I'm Reverend Starlette Thomas, director of the Raceless Gospel Initiative at Good Faith Media and host of the Raceless Gospel podcast. It's season 5, and we are giving you a love offering, an audio audit of the North American Church's messages about giving. A love offering. Join me, Reverend Starlette Thomas, your podcast pastor for season 5 of the Raceless Gospel podcast. Our 7 episodes will drop weekly on Wednesdays, beginning September 4th. Subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts and learn more at goodfaithmedia.org.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got a very special guest with us from our nation's capital. Skye Perryman is president and CEO of Democracy Forward, a nonpartisan national legal organization that promotes democracy and progress through litigation, regulatory engagement, policy education, and research. Perryman took the helm at Democracy Forward a few months after January 6, 2021, amid rising extremism in communities and courts nationwide. She has built a visionary team of legal, policy, and communications experts to confront anti-democratic extremism head-on while using the law to advance progress and a bold vision for the future. Perryman is also a member of our Good Faith Media Strategic Advisory Board. Skye, welcome back to Good Faith Weekly.
It's great to be back, actually. It's great. And I'm so super excited about this conversation.
It's so good to have you here, Skye. I appreciate you taking time to talk to us today and educate our listeners, as well as myself, on some of the issues you guys work on. But before we get started, some of our audience might not be familiar with Democracy Forward. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the organization, your mission, and your work?
Well, at Democracy Forward, we believe that in the ongoing project of freedom and of democracy, that it is something for everyone in this country, not just for the few, not just for the privileged. And so our organization is on the front lines of legal fights in the courts to protect people's rights, to advance our democracy. And then we also do a lot of work to make sure the public understands what's at play. In a democracy, it's important that people and communities be able to interface with all 3 branches of their government. And that 3rd branch of government is the courts. And sometimes it's harder for people to really interface in these courtroom battles that really are for the future of the country and for all of our rights. And so we do a lot of work with people and communities across the country to make sure they understand what's at stake. It's why I so admire the work you all do at Good Faith Media to help people understand. And that's a little bit about us.
Well, as I said in the introduction, Skye, you took the helm at Democracy Forward just after January 6, 2021. And on that terrible day, the extreme dangers of Christian nationalism were front and center. So before we get to some of the more specific topics that we want to talk with you about, let me just ask this. How has Democracy Forward countered the rising influence of Christian nationalism around the country since that horrific day?
January 6th certainly was a day that we all know and that many in Washington, of course, experienced, and is a real demonstration of the depths and rise of Christian nationalism, of white supremacy, of anti-democratic behavior in the country. But at Democracy Forward, we were on the front lines of these issues even before January 6th. In the prior administration, there were efforts by individuals to seek to restrict the ability of people to access healthcare using religion,
right.
The government using religion, weaponizing religion as an excuse for leaving people without health care. And Democracy Forward challenged that policy out of the Department of Health and Human Services. By the way, it's a policy that also appears in Project 2025. So it hasn't gone anywhere, but we challenged it successfully alongside the National Women's Law Center, and we're able to block that. And that's just one small example, and we can talk about other work that we do. But I think it's important to understand that January 6th didn't just come out of the sky. It has been a building movement, which of course you all talk about a lot on this podcast. We are on the ground in communities across the country, helping communities fight back against extremism in the schools where people are threatening the freedom to read. We have had to challenge laws in Arkansas that would criminalize librarians in 2024 in America, guys. And we've successfully challenged that on a temporary basis, and do a lot of other work to make sure that religion is not weaponized, and that the freedom of religion, which is actually a value in this country, is not weaponized to take away people's freedoms and liberties and ability to thrive.
Yeah, great.
So, Skye, there's another case that you and your team introduced us to, so we had not heard of it, but it's the Chevron deference case before the Supreme Court. I think some of our listeners may not have heard of that yet, and it is fascinating, it's important, and I think it's maybe a good one for you to introduce our listeners to as well.
Thanks for that question. I love that question. I don't always get it on podcasts. That's great. Well, a little constitutional history, which I know your listeners know, is that in this country, it is Congress that makes the laws, and it is the executive branch, the president, and all the federal agencies that are the heads of those agencies are appointed by the president, that have a constitutional obligation to take care to see that the laws are faithfully executed, to do the work. Congress can pass a law and say, we want to make sure that everybody can access healthcare in this way, or that people that are eligible for Medicaid should be able to understand their benefits, right? But Congress can't do all of the work in implementing those broad policy objectives. And that's the work that our federal agencies do. For 40 years, and if you go back in legal history, it was actually for about a century, federal agencies have looked at what Congress tells them to do, and they've gone to do that. And those federal agencies, if we're talking about things like the Food and Drug Administration or the Department of Health and Human Services or the Environmental Protection Agency, they're staffed with people who are experts. I don't know the safe particulate level of water, right? I don't know what makes medication safe versus what makes it dangerous, but the experts in our agencies do. Yep. And so those experts, when they implement policies and pass regulations, they often have to interpret what Congress said in the law. Congress may say, we want to make sure everyone has healthcare benefits. Well, what does all of that mean, and how does it mean? So it has generally been the case that courts, and the Supreme Court said this 40 years ago, that courts should not be activists. Courts are not policymakers. Courts don't have that expertise either. Judges, or many of them come from my background, they're lawyers, and they don't have this expertise either. And so it's really the court should defer to agency expertise when they're looking at what an agency does and determining whether it was lawful or not, that if on those interpretive questions, they should defer to the experts. Now, if the agency breaks the law or does something that's totally arbitrary, the courts obviously have an obligation under our laws to strike it down. So that's the concept of Chevron deference, is the notion that it's the courts will defer to these agency experts that Congress has empowered to interpret certain words in our laws. And that reason it's called Chevron is not because people like to get their gas at Chevron. It's because there was a case in the 1980s called Chevron versus NRDC, where actually judicial conservatives said it's really important to defer to agency expertise. At that point, maybe the Supreme Court might have been a bit more liberal.
Right.
And that was the Reagan administration, right? And
it's fascinating.
And so that's what Chevron means. And so that's the notion of Chevron deference. What happened last Supreme Court term is much like in Dobbs, where for many years there have been right-leaning organizations and very far-right organizations that have been seeking to undermine Chevron deference. They want to undermine the ability of our government to work for all people. They want to undermine the ability of our agencies to serve people. Basically, in the last term, the court overturned that principle, which we call of judicial humility, the principle that the courts are not the experts on all these highly technical issues and that we should defer to the agency's expertise. And the reason that that is concerning for all of us, because it seems very esoteric, but the reason that it's concerning for all of us is because across the country, we are all benefiting from the services that the federal government provides. We're relying on FDA to keep our food and drugs safe. We're relying on the EPA to do what it can about our climate and to keep our air safe, right? We're relying on these federal agencies and these experts. And now there are floods of litigation from special interest and far right groups, and yes, Christian nationalist groups. There's some in the abortion context and the civil rights context that are seeking to undermine these benefits that the federal government provides by in court. And now the Supreme Court has said that courts don't have to defer to what the agencies are deciding.
Give us an example of something that might happen specifically.
Well, I don't have to give you an example of what might happen because we've already seen it. So the court issued this decision overturning Chevron deference in late June. And we've already seen the case cited in more than 150 cases across the country.
Wow.
And the case has already been used by federal courts in my home state of Texas to undermine overtime eligibility for millions of American workers, because the Department of Labor sets the standard of how much you have to make to be eligible how much you make to be eligible for overtime. That's a standard that our labor experts set.
Wow.
And there are many groups that want to challenge that, special interest groups that don't want people to be paid fairly. And so we're already seeing the devastating impacts. The Alliance for Defending Freedom, which is a Christian nationalist group that you all have talked about before, they filed a brief at the Supreme Court, talking about all the regulations that protect access to health care and civil rights that they believe should be challenged if Chevron deference were to fall, which is what happened. And so we are seeing the impacts. Many of the things that we're seeing the courts do, particularly far-right courts do, and litigants seek to try to push the courts to do, are the very policy proposals that we also see in Project 2025. Just this week, net neutrality, which is sort of open internet and a really core way to regulate big tech. The Sixth Circuit has stayed the enforcement of the net neutrality rule out of the FCC, citing the decision that the Supreme Court issued. So it is a wonky thing, but it is really applicable to our everyday lives.
Yeah, and I don't think, the common citizen really understands the importance of this particular case because it touches every issue that we talk about here at Good Faith Weekly, from ecological justice to human rights because it is this total rejection of expert analysis and expert opinion and even oversight. So, corporations and even government agencies that are dominated by a certain political leaning can do anything they want to without any quorums about it at all or any checks and balances. It's really terrifying.
Well, and I'll tell you, we represented in the case before the Supreme Court associations that represented hundreds of thousands of small businesses. So it also affects small businesses because small businesses rely on a uniform federal standard. Federal regulations are important because small businesses don't have teams of lawyers like big corporations do that can go and say, well, in this state, under this judge's rule, you have to do this to comply with the, EPA's, to comply with the Clean Air Act. And on this state, under this judge's rule, you have to do this. That's not how it works. It's always been those federal standards that the agencies can set if they're reasonable and if they're lawful. And that is important in courts. Courts have to evaluate that, but within that standard of reasonableness, it was really deference to the experts. And so I think that it is important. I'm glad you guys, wanted to talk about it. And I think the other piece of that, which is just making sure as Americans that are going about our daily lives, we understand that there are people that work at these agencies that we don't see and we don't know, but they're career civil servants. They swear an oath to the Constitution. They are not controlled by any political party, that are really the ones doing a lot of the work of the American people.
Yeah.
And so cases like this are very concerning, as are proposals that we've seen in Project 2025 to sort of purge that expertise in other ways.
Yeah. Well, Missy, now you know why John Oliver cited Democracy Forward.
I know.
Just the other night.
I know. We both squealed when we saw it. Go Skye.
Because they're an expert on Sheffrin.
It's amazing.
And we've been, and what we have really tried to do is to monitor what is happening in all of these, lower courts across the country, so that people in communities can weigh in and make their voices heard, and that, that we can, ensure that the government's able to work for and deliver for people.
Yeah.
Well, Skye, I know another area that's very close to your heart is women's reproductive health. So since the Dobbs decision, conservative states have passed strict abortion bans, leaving women's lives in danger. So tell us a little bit about how Democracy Forward is working in this space.
We're doing a number of things. One, as part of our theme that people and communities and institutions need representation. We have been on the front lines in a lot of states. They're not just restricting access to abortion care. They're also restricting access to emergency care, including if that emergency care necessitates an abortion. And so that was the case that was before the Supreme Court last term. And there's cases out of Texas. And we're representing the nation's medical community. So groups like the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the American Medical Association, the American College of Emergency Physicians. Guess what? There's a lot of people in those associations that have a lot of different personal beliefs, but they are all aligned that from a medical perspective, it is incredibly harmful and endangers and threatens the lives of millions of people to have these types of restrictions. And so we're doing a lot of work in those cases. We also, at Democracy Forward, represent the generic manufacturer of the pill known as mifepristone, which is a pill that is used in medication abortion, which is for the early termination of pregnancy. And that's a pill, by the way, that's approved by and regulated by one of those federal agencies, the Food and Drug Administration, and special interest groups, including Christian nationalist groups like the Alliance for Defending Freedom, are seeking to deprive people of access to that medication. They're questioning the FDA and the FDA's regulation of the medication, and they sought to remove the approval for the medication in a case that went to the court this year. And so we're doing a lot of work to protect and preserve access to mifepristone, including in southern states like West Virginia, where the laws that are on the books there really do not enable people to access that care that is approved by our federal government for all people in all zip codes for the early termination of pregnancy. So those are some things we're doing, but we also do a lot of work to make sure people understand the real relationship between reproductive freedom and democracy. And that does not mean that everyone has to have the same personal view about every element of healthcare. But what it does mean that in this country, we should not be restricting people's ability to access the healthcare that they need. And when we start seeing those restrictions and bans, when we see reversals of these rights, those are markers of a backsliding democracy. And so we really want to make sure people understand the stakes, not just for women and people that need reproductive health care, but also for all of us.
Yeah. Well, if there's one bright spot in this area, and I really appreciate all that you're doing in the meantime, especially in states with these such restrictive abortion care laws, every time this issue goes to the people have been in favor of supporting abortion care and supporting women's rights to reproductive care. That is something that I think we can cheer about and gives us hope.
It's amazing. It's hopeful. By the way, it has been that case forever. I think you guys may have heard me say this, but I've never said it on your podcast. In Mississippi in 2011, there was an effort by Christian nationalists and far right extremists to put a personhood bill on the ballot in Mississippi, and that effort failed, which, by the way, is why Mississippi had to resort to their legislature, which is comprised of individuals from gerrymandered districts, right, that don't fully represent everyone in Mississippi, to pass the law that became the basis for Dobbs. Yeah. And so there is a true through line between this is an area where the vast majority of the American people do not want the government making these decisions, and yet there are attempts by a faction of our society to undermine people's rights and to insert the government there.
Yeah. Well, another issue at stake, Skye, and I'm sure you're aware of this, but there's a little election that's going to be taking place in about a month across the country.
You heard it here first.
That's right. But one of the central rights that makes us a democracy is our right to vote. And states like Oklahoma are purging voting rolls. Georgia is changing how it counts votes just weeks before the election. Some voters are very concerned about intimidation and interference on Election Day. So, Skye, what advice can you give concerned voters regarding their rights when it comes to voting?
Well, first of all, get registered and go vote.
Yeah.
And your vote matters. Don't let anyone tell you that it doesn't matter. It matters wherever you live. Your vote matters. And it is a sacred responsibility that we all have as people that have inherited this country and as people who want to be good stewards of the present and the future to vote. Now, for people that have concerns, there's a number of good resources, which of course we can share with you all in the show notes, but there's a number of good resources that you can find to tell you where to vote, tell you how to vote. The other thing I would say to people is this is actually a tactic in and of itself. So there is a tactic to make it seem like either your vote doesn't matter, so why do you need to go do that? Because, it's going to go one way, and there's that tactic. There's also a tactic to intimidate and chill people from using their voice or from making their vote, so that extremists who do not represent the majority of people can take more power than they should have, right? And so I would just say to your listeners, it is important. It's imperative that you do it, and that there's a lot of work going on to secure people in the ability to vote, and we can of course get some resources, and people are welcome to obviously visit the Democracy Forward website and reach out through our info email if you have questions about that as well.
Good.
So, Skye, another thing that we've begun to talk about at Good Faith Media is post-election. In a few weeks, we will either have our first female president in Kamala Harris, or we'll have a second Trump presidency. One thing we've been talking a lot about is that we know no matter what happens, Christian nationalism is not going anywhere. So it will either be a counter to be more vicious, or it will be a mandate to implement Project 2025. So help us begin thinking about the aftermath of whichever way this thing goes.
First of all, I hope we know in a few weeks, because there are going to be efforts, unfortunately, to deny the election, to undermine the election, and to try to use every means necessary to discredit the election results. So I will just say that, we need people to understand that extremists have been clear about that plan. And when extremists say something, we all need to believe them if the last few years have not shown us something. And so we need to be prepared for that. But there are good lawyers and great organizations and people that are going to ensure that votes are counted, and that the American people have the benefit, as they have had for many years, of free and fair election. But when we start thinking about what 2025 could look like, I'm so glad you asked this question, because we know that Project 2025 is actually not something that's in the future. It is something that's happening right now. It's happening where you are in Oklahoma.
Yes. If you live in states like we do, yes, it's here.
It's happening in the courts. Okay. I mean, a lot of the things that I was talking about of these post-Chevron deference decisions, they are right out. If you go look at Project 2025, guess what? It has a chapter on depriving people of overtime eligibility. And guess what? The legal arguments that are being made in court right now are. So it's happening in states and communities across the country, and it's happening in the courts. The question is whether it will also be happening at the highest levels of the federal government in ways that also have to be combated. But I think that what we need to do is we need to stay focused, which is that this is a threat to our democracy and to the best of our values. It is something that all of us have a responsibility to use our lives to combat. And by the way, we don't all have to be lawyers or podcast hosts. We don't all have to be pastors, right? You can be a parent going about raising your kid and making sure that hate has no place in your home and in your community. You can be a person that goes to the public library and tells your librarian, who, by the way, are being targeted right now, thank you for what you're doing. There's all kinds of ways to engage in our democracy in this time, but that's what we have to stay focused on. I hope that we get to be focused on combating those real threats for millions of people throughout our country without having to worry that the person that occupies the nation's highest office is, seeking to undermine our democracy. That is our sincere hope, obviously. But the work of protecting and advancing our democracy and our freedom is here. Rights have been reversed by the Supreme Court, even with a pro-democracy president, as we have seen, and there is a lot of work to be done. So that's how I think we should all start thinking about 2025 and making the plan, not just to go vote, which was the plan for 2024, but making the plan for what we're going to do in our lives to confront these threats.
So what you're telling me is my plan to go hide under the covers is not
it's
the
not
right
a good
one.
plan.
Well, not only is it not a good plan, by the way, it's a plan that extremists would love for you to go do, because that is one of the number one things. And in the extremist playbook and in the Christian nationalist playbook is to make people feel like there's nothing they can do and make people and deprive people of hope. Because when you deprive people of hope and people think there's nothing they can do and they do nothing as opposed to doing something, is where we end up with the backsliding democracy that we unfortunately have in the country. So,
all right. So I'm removing all the covers from the house.
I think that was more motivating than any sermon I ever heard.
Hey.
I just have to
well, Skye Perryman is president and CEO of Democracy Forward. And Skye, we always learn so much when we talk with you. But before we let you go, we've got one last question that Missy asked all of our guests. So Missy, take it away.
And before I ask it, I'm going to put in a plug for all of our listeners to be sure and follow Democracy Forward on all socials. They are doing unbelievable work. I'm so thankful that you guys are there. I'm thankful to have you as a friend and so appreciate everything you're doing. So before we go, Skye, as you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is there's more to tell. So in light of your work and our conversation today, what is your more to tell?
Well, here's what I'm going to say, and it'll get a little dark and then it'll get positive, I promise. But you started this podcast by asking me about January 6th, and I think we all have deeply personal and broader responses to that. But one thing that happened to the United States after January 6th was that we were added to a list of global backsliding democracies. Yeah. And that is because of election denialism. It is because of misinformation. And it is because of factions of people that do not represent the majority of people in this country, but that seek to legislate and achieve power in ways that trample on the rights of the majority of people in the country, that counter-majoritarian faction. And the United States has stayed on that list ever since because of reversals of rights at the Supreme Court, because of this continued misinformation, plans to undermine the right to vote, legislation to undermine the right to vote in many states. And last year, 13 presidential libraries from President Hoover to President Obama warned of the fragile state of United States democracy. And that's the state of our democracy today. And that's before we even hold an election. So the more to tell that I have is that we all have a generational responsibility to ourselves, to our kids, to our grandkids, to our communities, to reverse this concerning trend and to get out there this year and do what we can to advance and protect the remaining freedoms that we have, but then to be committed in 2025, regardless of any outcome, to the work that you all feature so much on Good Faith Media, but to the work of fully addressing the threats to our democracy, the rise of extremism, the rise of behavior that is harmful to people and communities and that's harmful to our overall society. So we've got a lot of work to do. That's my more to tell. And I so love your partnership and all that work.
All right, I'm with you. That was the best sermon I've heard in years. Well, Skye, you're always welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. Thank you so much. We're going to see you in a couple of weeks in our nation's capital, so looking forward to that time with you. But keep up the great work. You can check out Democracy Forward at democracyforward.org.
Thank you so much.
Every time we sit down with Skye Perryman, whether it's on the podcast or just in social settings, I am always challenged and inspired by her.
I mean, and we can add, my toes have been stepped on a little bit.
I noticed you had some scuffs on your toes.
Yeah. So she was talking about, I want to hide under the covers. And she's saying, this is not this is exactly what extremists want. They want you to not have hope that there's going to be any change, because then you're not,
right,
challenging that. And I feel like she's that friend on the playground that's like, come on, we're going. Like, these are the people I need in my life. Come on, we're going.
Come on, let's go.
Come out from under the bed. And so she is that person in my life. I'm so thankful for her in talking about ways in which we do need to fight for and protect our democracy.
Right.
So I was, thinking about, after our conversation, why this is important to our faith.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously, democracy in the word and in the way in which we think about it is not biblical per se,
right.
But we as people of faith feel that it is important.
Yeah, 100%.
So I thought I would give you an opportunity to now, step on some toes and maybe preach a little bit about why this is.
What, you're giving me a pulpit?
Reluctantly. I'm giving you a pulpit. But it is important. We are, like we said, we talk about faith and culture. And so, we've talked with Skye about democracy and about, working through the courts and things that they're doing. But bring it back for us. Why is this important from a faith perspective?
This is such an important question, because you're right. Democracy is a form of government. It's not necessarily found in the Bible. But the reality is there are so many biblical truths that lead us to this ideal of democracy. First and foremost, every person matters. Mm-hmm. Every person is endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights. You have the right to exist. You have the right to be heard. You have the right to represent yourself. And those are the truths that lead to democracy. When we think about the Bible, we think about that creation narrative. And in Genesis, where God creates humanity, from the dirt, and then breathes, God's Spirit into humanity. It is this, incredible expression of individualism, that everybody is somebody, and that somebody is part of a community. But you have a say. You have a personhood, you have an agency that demands respect and demands to be heard, because you are endowed by your Creator. And so for me, that is central to democracy. It is a bedrock principle of my faith that every person matters. And in a liberal democracy, that has been the struggle since our beginning, is who gets counted, who gets to have a voice. Early on in our liberal democracy, not everybody had a voice.
Nope.
And that the words that you read in the beginning, before we went to the interview, you read those and a chill goes down your spine, because you realize while those words are so important and so revolutionary, the reality is that was not true when they were written. And this is why we talk about the living, breathing Constitution. Words change over time, and why those ideals were set in stone on a parchment, they did not exist within the flesh and blood of community. But over time, we have been battling that. And the importance of bringing those words to life in the existence of our democracy here. Every person matters. Everybody should have a voice. And in a democracy, that means every person has a vote. And Skye talked about that in our interview, and that there has been a consistent effort, even from the beginning of our democracy and ramped up even today, to silence those voices, to silence that vote. And as a person of faith, I wake up every day thinking about how I can advocate for those who feel like they don't have a voice. It matters. It matters tremendously that you go to the polls and you cast your vote. And I think she said it well, and you and I have had conversations about this, that there are times where you feel like your vote doesn't matter, but it matters. It matters tremendously. And so everybody should go out and express their individualism and their conscience, because you've been given that by your Creator.
And so we are, as a nation, as a society, we are striving, like we've said many times before, to become a more perfect union, but also to live up to those standards that we have set for ourselves. And I think they're great standards to have, and we owe it to ourselves, to each other, to our country, to our world, to do just that, to do the best that we can.
Yeah. And, the reality is that we have to join our voices together in order to make certain everybody is heard. We can't just rely on somebody else to say it. You mentioned it to Skye that your go-to is to hide under a blanket and to withdraw. But that's exactly what people who do not want you to be heard, who do not want people who are marginalized to vote, that's their desire.
They're the Coyotes coming in. They just are a pack, and they come in so loud. The extremists, they're so loud.
So loud.
They just want to drown you, and they make, and that's just it. When they're on the hunt, when they're on the prowl to take over the nation, which is
take the nation back.
Right. They're just, if they can just be louder, then they'll silence others, because people like me go hide in a corner.
Yeah. But that's an excellent point, because you and I were talking about that earlier this week, that just that phrase of taking America back. And, it precedes Trump. I mean, it really does. What does that really mean? And just the irony of that phrase itself, take America back. We know what they are trying to communicate, but the reality is they are wanting to take America back where not everybody had a voice. And that is terrifying.
It really is.
That's why we have to get out of our comfort zone, Missy, and to get out there and keep working.
Keep working, absolutely. And also vote.
So the only way for democracy to move forward, Missy, is for us to go out there and be engaged.
Yes.
So no matter how loud the Coyotes howl at night, we've got to put our coats on and go out and save democracy.
All right, that's a stretch, but we're going to go with it.
You gave me a pulpit. I had to go for it.
All right, preacher, bring it home.
All right. Well, I just cannot say and stress this enough, and it's really echoing what Skye said, that we must stay engaged, keep fighting for democracy. It's the only one we have. It is too important, and the stakes are too high. And so this episode is very important. Skye's words, Skye's inspiration has motivated me. So, Missy, you and I are going to get out there, and we're going to do the work.
Okay.
Well, with Skye,
can I bring my covers?
You can always bring your covers. Well, with Skye's encouragement, Missy and I are going to go out and keep fighting for democracy, and we hope that you do too. We'll be back next week with another guest. And until then, keep living good faith. You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.